It was a bright summer morning in London, and the city was buzzing with tourists from all corners of the world. Among them was a little 7-year-old girl who had been counting down the days for this moment. She had circled this date on her calendar with a red marker months ago. Today was the day she would finally see Buckingham Palace with her own eyes. The girl clutched a small flag in her hand, the red, white, and blue colors of the Union Jack bright against her tiny fingers. She had saved every bit of pocket money her grandmother gave her, every coin she found under the couch cushions, just to buy this flag from the souvenir shop near their home. To her, this wasn't just a piece of cloth. It was a symbol of her dream coming true. Her mother walked beside her, holding her other hand gently, while her father carried a camera around his neck, ready to capture every moment. They had traveled from a quiet town up north, where everyone knew everyone, and the most exciting thing that happened was the annual village fair. London felt like another world entirely. The noise, the crowds, the massive buildings that seemed to touch the sky. As they approached the grand gates of Buckingham Palace, the little girl's eyes grew wider than dinner plates. The golden gates gleamed in the sunlight, and beyond them stood the magnificent cream-colored palace that she had only seen in picture books. But what really caught her attention were the guards. There they stood like toy soldiers come to life in their bright red uniforms and tall fuzzy black hats that seemed almost too big for their heads. They stood so still, so straight, that for a moment she wondered if they were even real people or just incredibly realistic statues. Her parents smiled at each other, watching their daughter's face light up with pure wonder. This was why they had saved up for this trip, why they had driven for hours through the countryside. To see this exact expression on their child's face made every penny and every mile worth it. The girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Can we go closer?" she asked, her voice barely containing her excitement. "I want to see the guards better." Her mother nodded, and they moved through the crowd of tourists, dodging selfie sticks and tour groups. Everyone was busy taking photos, posing with the palace in the background, chattering in different languages. But the little girl wasn't interested in photos. She wanted to really look, to really see. They made their way to a spot right near one of the guard posts. A guard stood there at perfect attention, his chin up, his eyes staring straight ahead at some invisible point in the distance. His rifle was held precisely at his side, and he didn't move even a muscle. Not even when a pigeon landed near his feet. Not even when a tourist waved a hand right in front of his face trying to make him smile. The little girl stood there, fascinated. She tilted her head to one side, studying every detail of the guard's uniform. The bright red jacket with its gold buttons that shined like little suns. The white belt that crossed his chest. The black trousers with a red stripe running down the side. And those tall black boots that went almost up to his knees. Polished so well she could almost see her reflection in them. Most kids would have gotten bored after a minute or two and run off to chase the pigeons or beg for ice cream. But not this girl. She stayed put, her eyes moving carefully over every inch of the guard's uniform, as if she was memorizing it for a test. Her father took a few photos, checking his camera screen to make sure they came out nice. Her mother glanced at her watch, wondering how long they should stay before moving on to see the other sites on their list. They had planned to visit the London Eye later, maybe grab some fish and chips for lunch. But their daughter showed no signs of wanting to leave. She took a small step closer, then another, her little flag still gripped tightly in one hand. Something about this particular guard had captured her complete attention. Maybe it was the way he stood or something about his expression, though his face was mostly hidden under that enormous hat. There was just something that seemed different, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The guard's posture was perfect, his face calm and professional. But if you looked very, very carefully, if you were at just the right height and angle, like a 7-year-old girl standing 3 feet away, you might notice the tiniest tension around his eyes, a slight tightness in his jaw that didn't quite match the relaxed stance of the other guards. But at that moment, the little girl hadn't quite figured out what was bothering her yet. She just knew something felt off, the way you know it's going to rain even before the first drop falls. That little voice in the back of her mind that grown-ups often learn to ignore, but children still listen to. Her mother touched her shoulder gently. "Sweetie, should we move on? There's so much more to see." The girl didn't answer right away. She kept staring, her young mind working like a detective trying to solve a puzzle. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the stone courtyard. More tourists arrived, creating a constant buzz of conversation and camera clicks. But in the little girl's world, there was only her and the guard, and the mystery her instincts told her was there, waiting to be discovered. She had no idea that in just a few moments her life was about to change forever, that her name would be in newspapers and on television screens, that people all over the world would soon know the story of what she was about to do. All she knew was that something was wrong, and she needed to figure out what it was. The little girl took another step closer to the guard post, her eyes never leaving the soldier standing before her. While everyone around her was busy snapping photos and chatting about their vacation plans, she was on a mission to understand what her gut feeling was trying to tell her. She started from the top, looking up at that massive bearskin hat. It must be so heavy, she thought. How did he keep it from falling off? Then her eyes traveled down to his face. He had a strong jawline, and his eyes, though staring straight ahead, seemed somehow tired. Or was it something else? She couldn't quite tell. Moving down further, she examined the bright red jacket again, counting the gold buttons. 1, 2, 3, 4. The white belt with its brass buckle that shined like a mirror. Everything looked perfect, exactly like the pictures in her books back home. But then her gaze lowered to his legs, to those black trousers with the red stripe, and finally to his boots. Those tall, shiny black boots that every guard wore, and that's when she saw it. The little girl froze completely, her small body going rigid. Her eyes locked onto the guard's left boot and her mouth fell open slightly. There, just visible on the polished black leather, was something that definitely shouldn't be there. A dark spot. A wet patch that seemed to be slowly spreading. At first she thought maybe he had stepped in a puddle. But the ground was completely dry. It hadn't rained in days, and the wetness was coming from inside the boot, not from the ground up. The dark stain was slowly seeping through the leather, getting bigger with each passing second. Her heart started beating faster. Something was very wrong. This wasn't water. This wasn't mud. The color was too dark, too red. Even at 7 years old, she knew what that color meant. She had scraped her knees enough times to recognize blood when she saw it. Without taking her eyes off the boot, she reached out and grabbed her father's hand, tugging it urgently. "Daddy," she whispered, but he was looking the other way, reading a plaque about the history of the palace guards. She pulled harder. "Daddy." Her voice was louder this time, more insistent. Her father looked down, about to tell her to wait a moment, but something in her expression stopped him. Her face had changed completely. The wonder and excitement were gone, replaced by worry and concern that seemed too mature for such a young child. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, crouching down to her level. The girl pointed straight at the guard's boot, her small finger extended like an arrow. "Look at his boot, Daddy. Something's wrong with his boot." Her father glanced up at the guard, then back at his daughter, slightly confused. "What do you mean? It looks fine to me." "No." The girl's voice was rising now, drawing the attention of a few nearby tourists. "Look closer. There's something wet on it, something dark." Her mother had turned around now, wondering what the fuss was about. Other visitors started to glance their way, some with annoyed expressions, others with curiosity. A few people held up their phones, thinking maybe something interesting was happening that they should record. The little girl's frustration grew. Why weren't the grown-ups seeing what she was seeing? It was right there, plain as day. She pulled her father's hand again, more urgently this time, practically dragging him closer to the guard post. The guard, meanwhile, remained absolutely still. His training had taught him to ignore distractions, to stand firm no matter what happened around him. People tried to make guards laugh or break their concentration all the time. It was part of the job. Children would make funny faces, tourists would tell jokes, some people would even try to touch the uniform. But this was different. Through his peripheral vision, the guard could see the little girl pointing at his boot. He could hear her urgent voice, the worry in her tone. And deep down, beneath his professional exterior, a small part of him felt a wave of relief. Someone had noticed. Finally, someone had seen, but he couldn't break his stance. The rules were clear. The tradition was sacred. He was a king's guard, and he would maintain his post unless officially relieved of duty. Even if every fiber of his being wanted to acknowledge this child who had somehow spotted what no adult had seen. The girl's father finally moved closer, humoring his daughter even though he was slightly embarrassed by the scene she was creating. He bent down, following her pointing finger, really looking at where she was indicating, and then his face went pale. His eyes widened. His mouth opened, but no words came out for a few seconds. "Oh my God," he finally whispered. He saw it now. The dark stain spreading across the guard's boot, the way it glistened wetly in the sunlight, the unmistakable color of blood seeping through black leather. The girl's mother rushed over, asking what was happening, her voice tinged with worry. When her husband pointed to the boot, she gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth. The tourists around them started to notice that something real was happening. This wasn't just a child being silly. The parents looked genuinely alarmed. Phones that had been taking photos of the palace started turning toward the guard, and the small family gathered near his post. The little girl stood her ground, her flag still clutched in one hand, the other hand still pointing at the boot. She had seen something wrong, and she wasn't going to be ignored, not when someone needed help. Her parents had always taught her to speak up when she saw something dangerous, to help others when they were in trouble. She didn't care that everyone was looking at her now. She didn't care that some people were filming. She didn't even care that she was breaking some unspoken rule about not bothering the palace guards. All she cared about was that the soldier in front of her was hurt, and someone needed to do something about it right now. The guard's eyes flickered ever so slightly. Just the tiniest movement that most people wouldn't catch. But the little girl saw it, and in that brief moment she saw something else too. Gratitude, relief, and pain that he had been hiding behind his perfect military mask. She squeezed her father's hand tighter. "Daddy, we have to help him. He's bleeding. We have to tell someone." The morning that had started with such joy and excitement had suddenly transformed into something else entirely. The little girl who had come to see the famous guards was about to become the person who saved one. And nothing would ever be quite the same again. The father's mind was racing. He was just an ordinary man, a bank clerk from a small town, standing in front of one of the most famous buildings in the world, looking at a guard who was clearly in trouble. What was he supposed to do? What was the right thing to do? He looked around quickly, hoping to spot another guard or someone in charge. But the other guards were at their own posts, too far away to call without shouting. Security officers were visible near the gates, but they were dealing with the crowds, checking bags, answering tourist questions. His daughter tugged at his sleeve again, her small face looking up at him with complete trust. She believed he could fix this. She believed grown-ups always knew what to do. The weight of that trust made his decision for him. "Stay here with Mum," he told his daughter gently, then turned to his wife. "Call for help. Call 999. Tell them there's a medical emergency at Buckingham Palace." His wife nodded quickly, already pulling out her phone with shaking hands. Her fingers fumbled with the screen for a moment before she managed to dial. Meanwhile, her husband did something that probably broke at least a dozen rules and protocols. He stepped over the low barrier rope. The rope was there for a reason. Tourists weren't supposed to get too close to the guards. It was a boundary that everyone respected. But this wasn't about getting a better photo or touching the uniform for a joke. This was about a human being who was hurt and needed help. The man walked right up to the guard, his heart pounding in his chest. Up close, he could see sweat beading on the guard's forehead despite the relatively cool morning. The man could see the slight tremor in the guard's jaw, the barely visible tension in his shoulders. This soldier was using every ounce of his training and willpower to remain standing. "Sir," the man said, his voice respectful but urgent, "my daughter noticed you're bleeding from your boot. You need medical attention. Are you all right?" The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead. His lips didn't move. His expression didn't change. But something flickered in his eyes. A moment of acknowledgement, of relief, of gratitude, but he didn't break his stance. Couldn't break his stance. Years of training, discipline, and pride kept him rooted to that spot. He was a king's guard. He had a duty, a tradition to uphold. You didn't just abandon your post because of a little pain, except it wasn't a little pain anymore. It hadn't been for quite some time. And the guard knew, somewhere in the rational part of his brain that was fighting against his training, that this was becoming seriously dangerous. By now, other tourists had started to notice the commotion. People stopped taking selfies and turned to look. Murmurs spread through the crowd like ripples in water. Phones were raised, not for photos of the palace anymore, but to record whatever was happening near the guard post. A security officer had noticed the man crossing the barrier rope and was heading over quickly, his face set in stern lines. This was exactly the kind of tourist behavior that caused problems. People thought they could do whatever they wanted, break the rules for a better photo or a funny video. But as the security officer got closer, the father pointed down at the guard's boot and said loudly, "He's bleeding. Look at his boot. He needs help now." The security officer's expression changed in an instant. His eyes dropped to the boot and he saw what the little girl had seen, what the father had confirmed. The dark stain had grown even larger now. It was unmistakable. The officer's hand flew to the radio on his shoulder. "Control, this is Post 7. We have a medical emergency at the North Guard Station. I need medical assistance immediately. One of our guards is injured and bleeding." "I repeat, immediate medical assistance required." The response crackled back instantly. Help was on the way. The little girl watched all of this from behind the rope, holding her mother's hand tightly. She felt scared but also somehow proud. She had been right. She had seen something that needed attention, and now people were listening. Now something was being done. Her mother had finished her call to emergency services and was explaining everything to the operator. "Yes, at Buckingham Palace. One of the guards. His boot. There's blood. My daughter saw it first. Please hurry." More security officers were arriving now, some of them speaking into radios, others beginning to move tourists back to create space. The atmosphere had completely changed. What had been a cheerful tourist spot moments ago had transformed into the scene of an emergency. One of the senior officers approached the guard directly, speaking to him in a low, firm voice. "Son, medical is on the way. How long have you been bleeding?" The guard's lips barely moved, but words came out quiet and strained. "Since the changing of the guard, sir. Equipment malfunction. Didn't want to break formation." The officer's jaw tightened. That had been over 30 minutes ago. Maybe longer. "You should have signaled, soldier." "Thought I could complete my duty, sir," the guard replied, his voice steady despite everything. Didn't seem serious at first, but it had become serious. The blood loss, the time standing at rigid attention, the pressure of the boot keeping everything compressed. It had all created a dangerous situation that the guard had hidden behind his professional mask and his impressive uniform. Through the gates, the sound of sirens could be heard approaching. The little girl perked up at the sound. The ambulance was coming. Help was really coming. She looked up at her father, who had stepped back behind the rope now, and saw something in his face she had never seen before. He looked shaken but also determined. He had done the right thing even though it had been scary, even though he had broken the rules. Her mother squeezed her hand and whispered, "You did good, sweetheart. You really did good." The girl felt a warm glow in her chest. She hadn't been making a fuss over nothing. She hadn't been silly or annoying. She had noticed something important, something that adults had missed, and she had refused to be quiet about it. The other guards at their posts remained at attention, but their eyes showed concern for their fellow soldier. They couldn't break formation either, but you could see the worry in their faces. One of their own was in trouble. The crowd of tourists had grown larger, everyone wanting to see what was happening. Some felt genuine concern, others were just curious, drawn to drama like moths to a flame. But they were all kept at a safe distance now by security officers who formed a protective ring around the guard post. And in the center of it all stood the guard. Still at attention, still maintaining his post, his face pale but composed, waiting for permission to finally let go, to finally admit that he needed help. That permission was coming, racing through the London streets with sirens blaring and lights flashing. And it was all because a 7-year-old girl with a flag in her hand had looked at exactly the right place at exactly the right time, and had refused to be ignored. The ambulance pulled up to the palace gates with its siren wailing, and the sound echoed off the historic stone walls. Security officers rushed to open the gates wider, waving the emergency vehicle through with urgent gestures. The tourists, who moments ago had been taking casual holiday photos, now stood in hushed silence watching the scene unfold like something from a movie. The little girl stood on her tiptoes, trying to see over the shoulders of the adults in front of her. Her flag hung limply at her side now, forgotten in the tension of the moment. She watched as paramedics in their bright green uniforms jumped out of the ambulance, grabbing medical bags and moving quickly toward the guard post. The senior security officer met them halfway, speaking rapidly and pointing to the guard. The paramedics nodded and rushed over, their trained eyes immediately assessing the situation. One of them knelt down beside the guard's boot while the other stood ready with medical supplies. "Sir, We're going to need to remove your boot to assess the injury, the lead paramedic said, looking up at the guard's face. Can you sit down for us? The guard remained standing, still at attention, though his face had gone even paler than before. Sweat was now clearly visible on his forehead and temples. His jaw was clenched tight, and there was a tremor in his hands that he couldn't quite control anymore. The senior officer stepped forward and placed a hand on the guard's shoulder. You're relieved of duty, soldier. Sit down. That's an order. Finally, with permission granted, the guard's rigid posture began to crumble. It was like watching a statue come to life. His knees buckled slightly, and 2 security officers rushed forward to catch him before he fell. They helped him to the ground, supporting his back as they eased him into a sitting position against the wall of the guard post. The moment he was down, the guard let out a breath he seemed to have been holding forever. His head tilted back against the wall and his eyes closed briefly. The relief of finally being able to stop, to rest, to let go of that iron discipline was visible on his face. The paramedics worked quickly now. One of them carefully began unlacing the tall boot, while the other prepared bandages and other medical supplies. The crowd watched in complete silence. Even the children had stopped making noise. There was something about the seriousness of the moment that had quieted everyone. The little girl's mother pulled her daughter closer, wrapping an arm around her small shoulders. Don't worry, baby. They're going to help him now. As the paramedic pulled off the boot, several people in the crowd gasped. The guard's sock was soaked completely through with blood. The dark red stain was shocking against the pale skin of his leg. The paramedic immediately applied pressure with gauze, working efficiently while speaking in calm, professional tones to his partner. Deep laceration. Looks like it's on the calf. Significant blood loss. We need to stop the bleeding and get him transported. The other paramedic was already setting up an IV line, preparing to replace some of the fluids the guard had lost. They worked like a well-oiled machine, their movements precise and confident. This wasn't their first emergency, and they knew exactly what to do. The father watched all of this with his arm around his wife, his other hand resting protectively on his daughter's head. He felt shaky himself, the adrenaline of the last few minutes catching up with him. He had just been a tourist wanting to show his family a good time. Now he was witness to a medical emergency. One of the senior officers approached the family, his expression a mix of gratitude and concern. He was a tall man with a commanding presence, but his voice was gentle when he spoke. Thank you, he said simply, looking down at the little girl. What's your name, young lady? The girl looked up at him shyly, suddenly aware that this very important-looking man was talking directly to her. I'm 7, she said, which wasn't quite an answer to his question, but it made the officer smile despite the seriousness of the situation. Well, you have very good eyes for a 7-year-old, he said. You noticed something that everyone else missed. This soldier is going to be okay because of you. The girl nodded, not quite sure what to say. She looked over at the guard, who was now being lifted onto a stretcher by the paramedics. His eyes were open and he was talking to them, answering their questions. That was good, right? If he could talk, he must be okay. The paramedics had wrapped his leg in heavy bandages and the bleeding seemed to be under control now. They were preparing to load him into the ambulance. But before they did, the guard turned his head toward the little girl and her family. His face was still pale, but his eyes were clear and alert. He raised one hand slightly, a small wave, and mouthed the words, "Thank you." The little girl's face broke into a huge smile. She waved back enthusiastically with her flag, and for the first time since this whole thing started, she felt like everything was going to be all right. The soldier was going to be okay. The grown-ups had listened to her. She had helped. The ambulance doors closed with the guard inside and the vehicle pulled away, its siren starting up again as it headed toward the hospital. The crowd of tourists slowly began to disperse, though many were still talking excitedly about what they had just witnessed. Phones were out everywhere, people texting friends and family, posting on social media about the incredible thing they had just seen. The senior officer stayed with the family for a few more minutes, asking for their contact information. We'll want to follow up with you, he explained. The guard will want to thank you properly when he's recovered, and there may be some questions about what happened here today. The father provided their information, still feeling slightly dazed by everything. His simple family vacation had turned into something extraordinary. His daughter had quite literally saved someone's life today. Security officers were already reviewing the footage from security cameras, trying to understand exactly what had happened and when the guard had been injured. The changing of the guard ceremony would be reviewed. Protocols would be examined. This couldn't be allowed to happen again, but for now the immediate crisis was over. The guard was on his way to the hospital, the bleeding was controlled, and he was going to make a full recovery, all because a little girl with a flag had been looking at exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. As the family finally prepared to continue with their day, the little girl looked back at the guard post one more time. Another guard had already taken the position, standing at perfect attention, his uniform pristine and perfect, but she would never look at those guards the same way again. Now she knew they weren't just statues or decorations. They were real people doing a difficult job, standing in the heat and the cold, maintaining tradition and discipline even when it was hard, and she had helped one of them when he needed it most. That was something she would remember for the rest of her life. At the hospital, the guard was rushed into the emergency department where doctors and nurses immediately took over his care. The paramedics had done an excellent job stabilizing him, but now it was time for a thorough examination. The medical team carefully removed the bandages, cleaned the wound, and assessed the damage. The injury was serious, but not life-threatening, thanks to the quick action that had been taken. The guard had suffered a deep cut to his calf muscle, the kind of wound that bled heavily but could be treated effectively with proper medical care. What worried the doctors more was the amount of blood he had lost while standing at his post for over 30 minutes. "You're a lucky man," the doctor told him as she stitched up the wound with careful precision. "Another 15 or 20 minutes and you would have been in real trouble. You could have passed out, hit your head in the fall. Blood loss at that level can cause serious complications." The guard nodded quietly, feeling foolish now for not having broken his stance earlier. His training had taught him to endure, to push through pain, to never abandon his post. But it had also nearly caused him to put himself in genuine danger. Pride and discipline were admirable qualities, but not when they risked your life. Back at the palace, a full investigation was already underway. The commanding officers needed to understand exactly what had happened and why. How had a guard been injured during the changing of the guard ceremony? Why hadn't the injury been noticed by his fellow soldiers? What could be done to prevent this from happening again? Security camera footage was reviewed frame by frame. The investigators watched as the guards performed their precise choreographed movements during the changing ceremony. Everything looked perfect, flawless even. The tourists watching had no idea anything was wrong. The other guards showed no signs of concern. Then, about 14 minutes into the ceremony, there it was. A brief moment when one guard's rifle shifted slightly during a complex maneuver. The bayonet attached to the rifle caught the trouser leg of the guard next to him, slicing through the fabric and into his calf in one quick motion. The injured guard's face showed a flash of pain, just for a split second, but then it was gone. His expression returned to that perfect mask of composure. He completed the ceremony flawlessly, marching to his position, taking his stance. No one watching would have known anything was wrong. "Incredible discipline," one of the reviewing officers murmured, watching the footage, "but incredibly foolish, too." The investigation report would later note that the injury had been an accident, a rare mishap during a ceremony that had been performed thousands of times without incident. But it would also recommend new protocols. Guards would be instructed that signaling a medical emergency did not break their honor or their duty. There would be new training about recognizing when discipline crosses the line into dangerous pride. Meanwhile, news of what had happened was spreading like wildfire. Someone in the crowd had filmed the little girl pointing at the guard's boot. Another tourist had captured the moment the paramedics arrived. These videos were being shared across social media platforms, racking up millions of views within hours. The headlines started appearing on news websites. "Little girl saves palace guard." 7-year-old's sharp eyes prevent tragedy at Buckingham Palace. Young tourist spots what everyone else missed. The family's phone started ringing. News organizations wanted interviews. The palace press office wanted to coordinate statements. The whole thing was becoming much bigger than any of them had imagined. The father sat at their hotel that evening, scrolling through his phone in amazement. Their daughter's face was everywhere. Well, not her face exactly. Most of the photos and videos showed her from behind, pointing at the guard. But their story was being told and retold across the internet and television news. His daughter was in the hotel bathroom, taking a bath and playing with the rubber ducks provided by the hotel, completely unaware that she had become famous. To her, it had been an exciting day, yes, but now she was ready for dinner and maybe some ice cream. She had no concept yet of how much attention her actions had received. Her mother sat on the bed, reading through the messages and emails that kept flooding in. A morning talk show wanted them to appear. A newspaper wanted an exclusive interview. The palace itself had sent a formal message thanking them and asking if they would be willing to participate in an official acknowledgement once the guard had recovered. "This is insane," the mother said quietly to her husband. "We just came here for a vacation. We were supposed to see the London Eye this afternoon." "I know," her husband replied, running his hand through his hair. "But our daughter did something amazing. Something that matters. People want to hear about it." At the hospital, the guard was moved from the emergency department to a regular room. The doctors had determined he would need to stay overnight for observation, mainly to make sure the blood loss hadn't caused any complications. He was hooked up to an IV, receiving fluids and antibiotics to prevent infection. His commanding officer came to visit him, sitting in the chair beside the hospital bed with a stern expression that gradually softened. "That was some display of discipline out there, soldier," the officer said. "Stupid but impressive." The guard managed a weak smile. "I thought I could tough it out, sir. Didn't realize how bad it was." "The boot was hiding it," the officer acknowledged. "The compression probably slowed the bleeding at first, made you think it wasn't serious. But you lost a significant amount of blood. You're going to need time to recover." "How long, sir?" "At least 2 weeks off duty. Maybe longer depending on how you heal." "Doctor's orders." The officer leaned forward slightly. "There's something else you should know. A little girl spotted your injury. She's the one who raised the alarm. If it hadn't been for her, we might be having a very different conversation right now." The guard's eyes widened. "A child? 7 years old. She noticed the blood on your boot when dozens of adults walked right past you without seeing a thing. Her parents called for help. They quite possibly saved your life." The guard was quiet for a moment, processing this information. He had been saved by a child. A tourist child who had simply been observant enough to notice what others missed. He felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Gratitude, humility, and a strange sort of wonder. "I'd like to thank her," he said quietly. "If that's possible." "We're arranging it," the officer replied. "Once you're out of here and back on your feet. The palace wants to do something proper, something official. This story is all over the news and it reflects well on everyone involved. A child helping a soldier. Ordinary citizens doing the right thing. It's the kind of story people need right now." The guard nodded, then asked, "What about my injury?"
"How will this affect my position?"
The officer's expression became serious again. "There will be an investigation, as you know. But this was ruled an accident. Equipment malfunction. You won't face disciplinary action. However, we are implementing new protocols based on what happened. Guards will be instructed to signal if they're injured, no matter what. Duty is important, but your life is more important." Later that night, as the guard lay in his hospital bed staring at the ceiling, he thought about the little girl who had saved him. He didn't even know her name yet, but he owed her everything. He thought about how close he had come to disaster, how his pride and training had nearly cost him dearly, and he thought about how sometimes the smallest voices see the biggest problems, how a child's innocent observation could be more valuable than an adult's assumptions. He made a silent promise to himself that when he met her, he would make sure she understood just how important her actions had been. By the next morning, the story had exploded across every news platform imaginable. The family woke up in their hotel room to find their story was trending on social media, featured on national morning shows, and being discussed on radio stations across the country. The video of the little girl pointing at the guard's boot had been viewed over 20 million times. People were sharing it with captions like "Faith in Humanity," "Restored," and "Never ignore a child's intuition." The comment sections were filled with praise for the girl's awareness and her parents' quick action. News anchors were showing the footage and discussing the incident with military experts, medical professionals, and child psychologists. Everyone had something to say about what had happened. Some focused on the guard's incredible discipline. Others talked about the importance of teaching children to speak up when they see something wrong. Many simply celebrated the happy ending. The little girl sat on the hotel bed eating her cereal, watching cartoons on the television, while her parents fielded phone call after phone call. She had no idea that on other channels people were talking about her. She was just happy that the soldier was okay and wondering if they would still get to see the Tower of London today. Her parents had made the difficult decision to accept some of the interview requests. Not all of them, that would be impossible, but they chose a few that seemed respectful and appropriate. They wanted to make sure the story was told correctly and that their daughter wasn't overwhelmed by the attention. The first interview was scheduled for later that morning with a major news network. A crew would come to their hotel to film it. The parents were nervous, having never been on television before, but they wanted to honor what their daughter had done. When they explained to their daughter that some people wanted to talk to them about what happened yesterday, she seemed more interested in whether she could wear her favorite dress than in the actual interview. "Can I bring my flag?" she asked, clutching the Union Jack she had bought with her saved pocket money. "Of course you can," her mother said, smoothing down her daughter's hair. "That flag was part of your special day." Meanwhile, across London, the guard was being discharged from the hospital. The doctors had determined that he was stable enough to go home and continue his recovery there. He would need to keep weight off his injured leg for a few days and return for a follow-up appointment. But the prognosis was good. A car was waiting to take him back to his quarters. But first he had to run a gauntlet of reporters who had gathered outside the hospital. They shouted questions at him as he walked to the car, supported by a fellow soldier. "How are you feeling? Do you want to meet the girl who saved you?" What went through your mind during those 30 minutes? "Will you continue as a palace guard?" He didn't answer any of them, simply nodding politely and getting into the car. The palace had advised him not to speak to the press without coordination, but his mind was full of things he wanted to say, especially to that little girl and her family. Back at the hotel, the interview was underway. The reporter was kind and gentle, especially when speaking to the 7-year-old, who sat between her parents on a couch, swinging her legs because her feet didn't quite reach the floor. "Can you tell me what made you look at the guard's boot?" the reporter asked with a warm smile. The girl thought about this seriously. "I don't know. I was just looking at everything. His hat, his jacket, his boots. And then I saw something wet and it looked wrong, like when you scrape your knee and it bleeds. I thought he might be hurt. Were you scared?" "A little bit. But my mummy and daddy always say if someone is hurt, you should try to help them. So I told my daddy." "That was very brave of you," the reporter said. "Do you know that a lot of people are calling you a hero?" The girl's eyes went wide. "A hero, like in stories?" "Yes, exactly like in stories. You saved someone who needed help." The girl seemed to consider this, then said matter-of-factly, "I just did what anyone should do." That soundbite would be played over and over again on news broadcasts. The simple wisdom of a 7-year-old stating what should be an obvious truth. Helping people in need is just what we should do. Her parents were asked about how they felt, about their decision to act quickly, about their pride in their daughter. The mother got a bit emotional, her eyes filling with tears as she talked about how she had raised her daughter to be kind and observant. "We never expected anything like this," the father said. "We were just on vacation. But we're so proud of her. She saw something wrong and she didn't stay quiet about it. I think that's a lesson for all of us." The interview aired that afternoon and was immediately picked up by news outlets around the world. The story crossed international borders, being translated into dozens of languages. In America, in Australia, in Japan, in Brazil, people watched the footage and read about the little British girl who saved a palace guard. Social media was flooded with positive messages. Parents posted about teaching their children to speak up. Teachers talked about showing the video in class to discuss awareness and helping others. Mental health advocates used it as an example of why we should never ignore our instincts when we sense something is wrong. There were some critics, of course. There always are. Some people argued that the guard should have broken protocol immediately when injured. Others questioned whether all this attention was appropriate for such a young child. But these voices were drowned out by the overwhelming positive response. Children's charities reached out, wanting the little girl to be part of campaigns about child safety and awareness. A publisher contacted her parents about potentially writing a children's book based on the story. A toy company wanted to create a special edition teddy bear dressed as a palace guard, with proceeds going to military family charities. The family was overwhelmed. They had to hire someone to help them manage all the requests and offers coming their way. They made a decision early on that they would not exploit their daughter's moment of fame. Yes, they would do some interviews and accept some honors, but they would protect her childhood and her privacy as much as possible. The little girl herself remained remarkably unaffected by all the fuss. She was excited that people thought she did a good thing, but mostly she was still just interested in being 7 years old. She wanted to play with her toys, watch her cartoons, and yes, finally see the Tower of London. "Can we go tomorrow?" she asked her parents that evening after a long day of phone calls and interviews. "I want to see where they kept the lions." Her parents looked at each other and laughed. Their daughter was famous around the world, but she was still just a kid who wanted to see lions at the Tower of London. "Yes, sweetheart," her mother said, hugging her close. "Tomorrow we'll go see the tower. No more interviews tomorrow. Just us having fun?" the little girl beamed. "Good. And maybe we can get fish and chips for lunch? I'm really hungry." As they ordered room service for dinner that night, the family reflected on the surreal experience of the past day and a half. They had gone from anonymous tourists to the center of an international news story. But at the heart of it all was something simple and beautiful. A child who cared enough to help a stranger in need. And that, more than all the attention and praise, was what made her parents truly proud. They had raised a daughter with a good heart, sharp eyes, and the courage to speak up when it mattered. Whatever else came from this experience, that would always be the most important thing. 2 weeks after the incident, just as life was starting to return to normal for the family, a letter arrived at their home. Not just any letter. It was delivered by special courier and bore the official seal of Buckingham Palace. The parents recognized it immediately, their hands trembling slightly as they opened the heavy cream envelope. Inside was an embossed card written in elegant script. The palace was formally requesting the honor of their presence at a private ceremony to recognize the little girl's actions. The guard had made a full recovery and specifically requested to meet the family who had helped save his life. The mother read the letter 3 times to make sure she wasn't imagining it. "We're being invited to the palace," she whispered to her husband in amazement. Not as tourists this time, as actual guests. The father sat down heavily on the sofa, the reality of it sinking in. Their daughter, their ordinary, wonderful 7-year-old daughter, was going to be honored at Buckingham Palace. How had their lives taken such an extraordinary turn? When they told their daughter about the invitation, her reaction was pure excitement. "Will I get to see inside? Will there be crowns? Can I wear my special dress?" The questions tumbled out one after another. "You can wear whatever you like," her mother assured her, "though we might want to go shopping for something especially nice for such a special day." The day of the ceremony arrived with typical British weather, cloudy with occasional bursts of sunshine. The family traveled to London again, but this time their journey felt completely different. Instead of cramming into their small car with luggage and snacks, they were picked up by an official car sent by the palace. The little girl sat in the back seat, her face pressed against the window, watching London pass by. She wore a beautiful new dress that her grandmother had bought specially for the occasion, and clutched in her hand, as always, was her Union Jack flag. It was a bit worn now from being carried everywhere, but she wouldn't dream of leaving it behind. When they arrived at the palace, they weren't directed to the public entrance where tourists lined up. Instead, they were taken to a private gate where security officers checked their names on a list and waved them through with respectful nods. "This is really happening," the father muttered under his breath as they walked through corridors that most people never got to see. The walls were adorned with paintings and portraits. The carpets were thick and rich beneath their feet. Everything was elegant and slightly intimidating. A palace aide guided them to a private room, explaining that the ceremony would be small and intimate, just immediate family, a few palace officials, and of course the guard himself. The little girl held her mother's hand tightly, suddenly feeling shy in these grand surroundings. They waited in an antechamber, the parents making small talk to ease their nerves while their daughter examined everything in the room with wide eyes. She touched the fabric of the chairs gently, looked up at the high ceiling with its decorative molding, and peered at the paintings on the walls. Finally the door opened, and they were escorted into a beautiful reception room. And there he was, the guard, not in his familiar red uniform this time, but in formal military dress. He stood tall and healthy, all traces of his injury hidden beneath his perfectly pressed trousers. When he saw them enter, His serious military bearing softened immediately. His eyes went straight to the little girl and a genuine smile spread across his face. The introductions were made formally at first, with palace officials present and protocol being observed. But when the guard knelt down to the little girl's eye level, the formality melted away. "Hello," he said gently. "I've been wanting to meet you for a while now." The girl looked at him with recognition. "You're the soldier from before. Are you feeling better?" "I'm completely better thanks to you," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You saw something that no one else noticed. You spoke up when you could have stayed quiet. You saved my life." "I'm glad you're okay," the girl said simply. "I was worried about you." The guard had to blink back tears. Here was this small child, who had shown more awareness and courage than many adults, and she was just happy he was okay. No pride, no boasting, just genuine care for a stranger. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small box. "I have something for you. A way to say thank you." Inside the box was a beautiful certificate officially recognizing her actions, signed by senior palace officials and military commanders. But next to it was something that made the little girl gasp with delight. A teddy bear, dressed in a perfect miniature palace guard uniform, complete with a tiny red coat and a little bearskin hat. "He's beautiful," she exclaimed, hugging the bear immediately. "What's his name?" "Whatever you want to call him," the guard said with a chuckle. "But he's a very special bear. He's the only one of his kind, made especially for you." The ceremony continued with speeches and photographs. Palace officials talked about duty, about awareness, about the importance of helping others. The guard spoke about his experience, about his gratitude, and about the lesson he'd learned about pride versus safety. But the moment everyone would remember most was when the little girl stood up, walked over to the guard and gave him a big hug, still clutching her new teddy bear. The guard hugged her back, this small child who had become his unlikely hero. The palace photographer captured the moment, the tall soldier and the tiny girl, united by an extraordinary circumstance. That photograph would later be released to the press and would become one of the most shared images of the year. After the ceremony, there was tea and biscuits. The little girl sat with the guard, asking him questions about what it was like to be a palace guard while he patiently answered each one. He told her about the training, about standing in the cold and heat, about the history of the uniform. "Is your leg all better?" she asked, concerned. He pulled up his trouser leg slightly to show a neat bandage. "Almost completely healed. The doctor said I was very lucky." "Another few minutes and it could have been much more serious." The girl nodded seriously. "My mummy says we should always help people who are hurt, even if we're scared or shy, because everyone deserves help." "Your mummy is very wise," the guard said, "and you're very brave." As the visit came to an end, there were more photos, more handshakes, and more thank yous. The family was given a personal tour of parts of the palace normally closed to the public. The little girl was thrilled to see the grand rooms and hear the history behind them. When it was finally time to leave, the guard walked them to the door personally. He shook hands with the parents, thanking them for raising such a remarkable daughter and for acting so quickly that day. Then he knelt down one more time to say goodbye to the little girl. "You know," he said quietly, "being a palace guard is an honor. We're supposed to be brave and strong and always do our duty, but you taught me that it's okay to need help sometimes. And you taught me that the bravest thing isn't always standing still. Sometimes it's speaking up." The girl hugged her bear tighter and smiled. "Will you be at the palace when I come back to visit?" "I hope so," he said. "And if I am, I promise I'll wave at you. Just a little one, so the other guards don't notice." The family left the palace that day with hearts full of gratitude and amazement. What had started as a simple vacation had become a life-changing experience. They had met remarkable people, received incredible honors, and been part of something truly special. And the little girl, riding home in the official car with her teddy bear in her lap and her flag in her hand, fell asleep with a smile on her face, dreaming of brave soldiers and beautiful palaces, and the magic of helping others. The months that followed brought changes that none of the family could have predicted. The story of the little girl and the palace guard continued to resonate with people around the world. It wasn't just a feel-good news story that faded after a few days. It had touched something deeper in people's hearts and minds. Schools started using the story as a teaching moment. Teachers would show the video in class and talk about the importance of being observant, of speaking up when you notice something wrong, of trusting your instincts. Child safety organizations created educational materials based on the incident, teaching children that their observations matter and that adults should listen when they voice concerns. The little girl's school back in their hometown held a special assembly in her honor. She stood on the stage in the gymnasium, holding her teddy bear guard while the head teacher talked about what she had done. Her classmates gave her a standing ovation and she blushed bright red, not quite understanding why this was such a big deal. Her life had mostly returned to normal, though. She still went to school every day, still played with her friends, still complained about having to eat vegetables at dinner. But now, when teachers talked about heroes or bravery, her classmates would point to her and say, like when she saved the guard. The guard himself had returned to duty at the palace, though with a new perspective. He was more mindful now, more aware of the balance between duty and common sense, and whenever he stood at his post, he would occasionally see children in the crowd pointing at him excitedly, their parents telling them about the little girl who had spotted the bleeding guard. The incident had led to real changes in the palace guard protocols. Now guards were explicitly instructed that signaling a medical emergency was not a breach of duty but a requirement. There were new hand signals they could use to discreetly alert their fellow guards if something was wrong. Regular check-ins during longer shifts. A culture shift that said taking care of yourself wasn't weakness, it was necessary. These changes were implemented quietly, but they were significant. The palace had learned a valuable lesson, and they made sure it wouldn't be forgotten. The guard's commanding officers often use the incident as a teaching example for new recruits. Discipline is important, but your life is more important. Your duty is to serve, not to sacrifice yourself needlessly. The little girl's parents had handled the attention carefully. They had declined most of the commercial opportunities, not wanting to profit from their daughter's good deed. But they had accepted invitations that they felt were meaningful. A charity event for military families, a campaign about child safety awareness, a documentary about everyday heroes. The girl appeared in a children's safety video that was shown in schools across the country. In it, she talked simply about trusting your feelings when something seems wrong and not being afraid to tell an adult. Her natural, unpracticed way of speaking made the message more powerful than any scripted lesson could have been. If you see someone who needs help, she said directly to the camera, you should tell someone. It doesn't matter if you're little or if you think maybe you're wrong. It's always better to say something. 1 year after the incident, the family was invited back to the palace for the anniversary. This time the ceremony was larger, with press present and other families who had shown exceptional awareness and courage in various situations. But the little girl and the guard were at the center of it all, their story having inspired the entire event. The girl was now 8 years old, a bit taller, but still carrying that same Union Jack flag that had been with her on that fateful day. The guard greeted them like old friends, and it was clear a genuine bond had formed between them. I think about that day often, the guard told her parents, not just because of the injury, but because of what your daughter taught me. She reminded me that wisdom doesn't come with age or rank. Sometimes the most important observations come from the ones we least expect. The palace had also established a new award in honor of the incident, the Young Observer's Commendation, given annually to children who show exceptional awareness and help others in need. The little girl was naturally the first recipient. When she accepted the award, now more comfortable with public speaking than she had been a year ago, she said something that would be quoted in newspapers and on social media for weeks afterward. I wasn't trying to be a hero or anything special. I just saw someone who needed help and I said something. Everyone can do that. You just have to pay attention and care about other people. My teacher says that's called empathy, and it's really important. The simplicity and sincerity of her words resonated with people everywhere. In a world that often seemed complicated and divided, here was a child reminding everyone of a basic truth. Pay attention, care about others, speak up when something is wrong. The story even crossed into popular culture. A children's book was written about it, though heavily fictionalized to protect the real family's privacy. An animated short film was created and shown in cinemas before family movies. The little girl with the flag became a symbol of the difference one person can make when they simply choose to act. Years later, when the girl was older, she would be asked in interviews if she remembered that day clearly. Some parts are really clear, she would say. I remember how shiny his boots were and how worried I felt when I saw the blood. I remember my dad being scared but brave. And I remember feeling so happy when I found out the soldier was okay. That's what mattered most to me, that he was okay. The guard, who would eventually rise to a senior position in the palace guard, would tell his own children the story. I learned something important that day, he would say. I learned that pride can be dangerous, that asking for help is not weakness, and that sometimes the smallest voices have the most important things to say. The palace itself became a slightly different place after the incident. Guards were more human somehow. The public more aware that the red-coated soldiers were real people with real lives and real vulnerabilities. Tour guides would sometimes point to the spot where it happened, telling tourists about the little girl and the guard, about awareness and compassion and the importance of speaking up. The little girl grew up as all children do. She went on to have a normal life, pursuing her own interests and dreams. But that day at the palace never left her. It shaped how she saw the world and her place in it. It taught her that she had the power to make a difference, that her voice mattered, that caring about others was never a waste of time. She kept the teddy bear guard on a shelf in her room all through her childhood, and eventually passed it down to her own children, telling them the story of the day she helped a soldier at the palace. And she taught them the same lesson her parents had taught her. Pay attention to the world around you. Trust your instincts and never be afraid to help someone in need. The worn Union Jack flag was framed and hung on the wall, a reminder of a special day when an ordinary family vacation became an extraordinary moment of human connection and compassion. Below it, in simple letters, was a small plaque that read, "Sometimes the smallest actions make the biggest difference." And in a way, that was the real legacy of that summer day at Buckingham Palace. Not the awards or the news coverage or the fame, but the reminder that we all have the ability to help others, that awareness and compassion matter, and that speaking up when something is wrong is always the right thing to do. The little girl who stopped a British guard at the palace had done more than just save one man's life. She had reminded the world of the power of kindness, the importance of listening to children, and the extraordinary potential in ordinary moments. She had shown that heroes don't always wear capes or uniforms. Sometimes they're just 7 years old with a flag in their hand and a caring heart that refuses to stay silent when someone needs help. And that, more than anything else, was a lesson worth remembering.